Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chris Hernandez-Roy, and I'm the Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Americas Program at CSIS. Thank you for joining us today for this important event entitled The Ties That Bind, Strengthening U.S., Latin America, and the Caribbean Educational Exchange for Public Diplomacy, organized in partnership with the Institute of International Education, IIE. Before we begin, I have two housekeeping items to mention. This event will last 60 minutes and will consist of a panel discussion with my colleagues here, followed by a brief Q&A session. For our online audience, if you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A, please do so by clicking on the Ask a Question button on the web page. Again, good morning and thank you for being here. Educational exchanges have long been a cornerstone of U.S. diplomacy across the Western Hemisphere. Every year, over 80,000 students from Latin America and the Caribbean study in the United States, while more than 30,000 Americans pursue academic opportunities across the region. These exchanges generate meaningful economic benefits, but more importantly, they deepen trust, broaden cultural understanding, and create lasting networks among emerging leaders, researchers, businessmen, and policymakers. At a moment when the Americas confront a range of shared challenges, democratic erosion, economic stagnation, inequality, and rapid technological change, strengthening educational, cultural, and scientific partnerships offers a powerful mechanism to reinforce sustained and long-term cooperation and growth. People-to-people ties constitute a key pillar in U.S.-Latin American relations and contribute directly to public diplomacy, institutional strengthening, and regional stability. Today's discussion is part of a broader CSIS-IIE initiative examining how educational exchanges can be leveraged as a strategic tool to deepen U.S. engagement across the hemisphere. Through this effort, we aim to highlight actionable recommendations for expanding and modernizing education exchange opportunities, strengthening bilateral and regional partnerships, and ensuring that education remains a central pillar of cooperation between the United States and its partners in the Western Hemisphere. This CSIS-IIE collaboration has produced a policy brief and 3 commentaries exploring different aspects of U.S.-Latin American academic exchanges, including case studies on Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and Brazil, all of which are available on the CSIS Americas webpage. To delve into the subject this morning, we're pleased to be joined today by 3 outstanding experts who lead and shape educational cooperation across the Americas and beyond. Our first speaker is Dr. Mirka Martel, Head of Research, Evaluation and Learning at IIE. Dr. Martel leads IIE's global research portfolio, including the flagship Open Doors report on international education exchange and Project Atlas, which tracks worldwide student mobility trends. She brings extensive experience in international academic mobility, impact evaluation, and evidence-based policy research, and has directed numerous large-scale studies on the global landscape of higher education. Our next speaker is Dr. Ariel Fishbane, formerly the Director of the Education Program at the Inter-American Dialogue, and now an independent consultant. Dr. Fishbane previously served as Chief Economist for the Human Development Network at the World Bank and holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. He brings over 20 years of experience working on education and social policy issues across Latin America and globally. And our third speaker is Caroline Donovan-White, who's a Senior Director for Global Learning at NAFSA, Association of International Educators. Ms. Donovan-White oversees NAFSA's global learning portfolio, leading initiatives that advance internationalization across U.S. higher education and expanding opportunities for global engagement, student mobility, and cross-border collaboration. With extensive experience in international education policy, she has worked closely with universities, government partners, and global networks to strengthen institutional strategies for global learning. Together, our panelists will help frame our conversation by examining how educational exchanges advance U.S.-Latin American relations, what policy innovations are needed to expand and modernize these opportunities, and how education can serve as a strategic instrument for public diplomacy and regional cooperation. Welcome to all three of you.
Thank you.
Let's start with you, Mirka. Your research has tracked international education trends for years, and based on the latest data, what are the trends that you're seeing in student mobility between the United States and Latin America?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Well, it's exciting to be here and to talk about these mobility trends because they have a historic root. IIE has been doing the Open Doors report for over 75 years, and we have had international students coming to the United States from Latin America since that first year. As you mentioned, in the last year, we had over 80,000 international students coming to the United States. We do see a lot of some trends by academic level. We see that there is a large proportion of international students from Latin America that like to pursue undergraduate degrees, and we've seen that as a trend that has been fairly stable. And we also continue to see a growth in international students who are looking for work opportunities post-academic studies. So optional practical training, or OPT, has been another really popular trend that we've seen in terms of students wanting to get that practical work experience, and I'm sure we'll get into that as well. When we look in the outbound, so this now we're talking about study abroad, U.S. students studying abroad, we know that Latin America is a popular region for study abroad. We had over 30,000 students that studied abroad in the last year, and that grew by 4%. So we're continuing to see a lot of study abroad in the region. The study abroad trends that we focus on are mainly shorter term study abroad that is sponsored by a U.S. college or university. So in terms of that, some of the most popular regions include, for example, Costa Rica and other countries. And then finally, aside from Open Doors, we also have our Project Atlas initiative, which actually looks at full degrees. And so the last statistic I'll put out there is that over 27,000 students from the United States actually pursue full degrees in Latin America, and that includes in Mexico, Argentina, or Chile. So there are historical roots here in terms of international educational exchange, and I would say that education exchange is vital between these two regions and continues to be quite strong even with our latest data.
I can say that as a program, a regional program within CSIS that focuses on Latin America, and that takes 3 or 4 cohorts of interns every year, we've directly benefited from those exchanges.
Absolutely.
With Latin American students having studied here, who are fully bilingual and are taking advantage of the OPT you just mentioned a minute ago. So we are certainly a beneficiary of those exchanges. Ariel, why do educational exchanges remain one of the most powerful tools for strengthening the relations between the United States and our neighbors to the south? And how has the strategic value of these exchanges evolved over the last decade or so?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation, Chris. You said it in your introductory remarks, the importance of people-to-people connections. This is not an either-or, and it's complementary to the more formal diplomatic and commercial relations. But people-to-people, institution-to-institution connections really have a long-lasting effect, particularly in periods in which the more formal diplomatic or commercial connections go through stormy times. The links that we human beings have start playing a very important role. And I think all of us that have studied abroad at different points in our lives or work with people in a variety of countries know that those relationships are long-lasting and super important to all the work that we do. Looking at more from a historical perspective, I think there was a big change, I believe, around the end of the Cold War, where perhaps the more, if you want, geopolitical and considerations became less important in defining official policies enabling or promoting education exchanges. And to some extent, more market forces became more important. And at the same time, the 90s and 2000s were a period in which the higher education sector expanded dramatically in Latin America across the board. And so both the demand and the supply for exchanges increased. And now, on the other hand, there's been a number of shocks that have affected these flows. On the economic front, we saw it during the 2009-2010 global recession. We've seen it of course, with the COVID pandemic period. And then, the other factors that have been important in influencing this exchanges have been the shifting U.S. policies vis-a-vis Latin America, and I would say also the increase in crime and violence in the number of countries in Latin America that have affected the exchanges. So I think that's overall sort of a quick panorama.
I have a personal anecdote about the COVID. I drove my son, who is a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen, up to Canada during COVID. He was going to study in Montreal. He was going with his best friend, who's just an American citizen, who was going to study at McGill. They let my son in, and they didn't let his friend in because of the pandemic-era restrictions. And just a quick comment about your sort of painting of this historical trend, this change from a sort of geopolitical consideration to more market forces. I think we're now getting, to some extent, back into geopolitical competition, and I think we'll have a question about that a little later on with respect to competition in the region with China and how it attracts and seeks to support international exchanges for its own purposes. Caroline, in what ways does NAFSA support U.S. institutions in creating inclusive, high-quality opportunities for global student mobility?
Thank you. So NAFSA is a professional association of international educators, right? Our members come from all over the United States and around the world. They work primarily at higher education institutions. And what they come to NAFSA for is our training, our conferences, our publications, our dialogues that focus on these very topics. So our members, through that convening power and through that opportunity to talk with each other, are really sharing advice and best practices. How do we make students from different regions feel welcome when the news that they're seeing might be very, very different? How do we encourage U.S. students to go abroad when the news that they're seeing might be concerning to them? And they help each other find possible solutions. We talk a lot in our advocacy work about creating a welcoming immigration environment for international students to come to the United States. And I think we've had one of our most active years on that front in a really long time, especially with the changes proposed on OPT and other things like that. Our programs, like I can cite one that's happening today on a new International Student Resource Center that a colleague of mine will be doing a webinar about, so that people are aware that this is a resource center that your international students can use to learn more about adjusting to the United States, how they can prepare, what they should expect.
Excuse me.
Tomorrow, another webinar on supporting neurodiverse students in study abroad. So most of our work is to help the partners, our members, who and then in turn are talking to the students directly about why should you consider this opportunity here? What does this school have to offer you that another school in another region or elsewhere in the United States might have? And so all of those kind of go into, from the practitioner to the strategists who are a part of the NAFSA dialogue and a part of the NAFSA community, they can take those stories and ideas from their colleagues back to the student community and really help them see some of the benefits that you both have been talking about for international student mobility.
Mirka, back to you for a second here. How do educational exchanges in this region, in the Americas, contribute to the stability of the Americas and to sort of the economic dynamism and opportunity, and even sort of shared or expanding our sort of shared vision of democratic societies?
Yeah. So Ariel kind of started with this topic, which is really about the value of educational exchange in terms of people-to-people understanding. I think one of the critical areas of and reasons and value of international educational exchange is the ability of students to come to another country, to understand that country in terms of its cultures, in terms of its values. We speak a lot in the brief about the historical ties between the United States and Latin America. They've been there for many decades. And there really is a value here to continue this, particularly as global competition is growing in terms of hosting international students. So UNESCO in the last year just put out their latest statistics that over 7 billion students are international, 7 million, excuse me. I was going to say that would be the whole planet. 7 million students are globally mobile in terms of their education, which means they're crossing a border to pursue education. And they expect that that number will actually grow to over 10 million by 2030. So we continue to see a demand, as you said, demand and supply, a demand for international education. But we also see that there are many different countries that are looking to be hosts of international students. Those include markets like the United States and the UK and Canada, but also markets like China. And so we are looking at what is that value of continuing these international education exchanges for that people-to-people exchange, for soft diplomacy, for understanding that if we are to have people-to-people exchange, those ties will be there. They'll be there economically, they'll be there politically, they'll be there diplomatically. And so I think that there is this value for the United States and for Latin America to continue to focus on this as a real effort to continue to bridge these ties. I will say that economically, we know that international students from Latin America contribute over $4 billion to the US economy. And so there is a real economic impact here. We also know that the other way, US students studying abroad in Latin America also contribute over $3 billion. So there are real economic ties here as well that we can pursue, that we can grow, and that really speak to this connection between the two regions.
And Ariel, how can we make sure that these connections and these exchanges continue to be a pillar of US policy? You mentioned sort of ups and downs, and I mean, this is really important stuff.
It is, and I think it operates at various levels. You know, there's the more macro level, where I would say openness to trade, to movement of people, you know, create the overall environment for exchanges. And I think, you know, the reference there to Europe and what has happened in terms of creating over time a single market for education is a useful reference. That's at the more macro level. Then you have specific policies and programs that are directed at facilitating those exchanges. You know, the most obvious one is the whole question around visas. We were talking just before we started informally about this, and the complexity of the visa problem or visa issue both ways. Not just, you know, getting visas for foreign students to come to the U.S., but, you know, the correlate of that in other countries. On that front, I think one issue that is often not, in my humble experience, not emphasized enough is the role of the U.S. embassies can play. And not just in terms of their official relation with governments and ministries, but in terms of their connection with civil society in creating a dialogue and an interest in education exchanges. And then there's the institutional level. What can universities themselves do? And Caroline was mentioned a number of things that you guys are how you're empowering institutions to actually make it easier. I would add one element, which I'm sure will come up again in our conversation, and is the whole idea of hybrid programs. One positive outcome of the COVID period is we've all learned to do remote learning, and so this is not an either or. It's not that they're going to replace the physical movement of students, but I think universities, and some of them are already doing this, ought to start thinking more long-term in terms of how they connect with other partners in different countries through hybrid programs.
I want to just expand on that for a minute. So hybrid meaning that there's a virtual component.
There's a virtual component.
I guess if it's just a virtual component, this whole question of cultural understanding and learning in another country is kind of reduced, is it not? I mean, what's your views about that? Like, hybrid makes sense, but if we lean increasingly on virtual exchanges across borders, isn't that losing something of the essence of the whole point of cultural exchange and educational exchange?
I think if it's done intentionally, there are great ways to spark that interest, but also some studies show that collaborative online learning environments, in fact, can increase the engagement with people because you're intentionally working on a project together. I don't know about you, but I've worked on group projects where there is a cross-cultural difference between me and we have to work through those things together. So I think done intentionally, it is different. It is different. But I think there can be a real impact that we sometimes overlook because we're thinking of culture in more old-fashioned sense, I might say, of the language and the food and this. But you can have something that maybe helps you further on in your work environment by having done these projects and other things online together. So from the spark perspective, the curiosity perspective, I think they can be meaningful. And if they're well designed, I think that they can get towards that, but it's not the same. So we don't define it the same way.
That's what I was exactly going to say. I think during COVID-19, we learned that online is viable, it is exciting, and it is a valid modality. It does not replace in person. And I think we need to look at the two as both having that value. And I think that that's what we learned is, we thought, particularly during those years, kind of would in-person exchange go away? And we learned, no, we learned that there is still very much a desire for that in-person exchange. And for some individuals, for some who have a very specific purpose and an intention, online programming can actually be a really viable model as well. So I think we're working in a hybrid world anyway, very much so. And so I think education is another area where I think we're seeing that as well.
Okay. This being CSIS, we love questions about geopolitics. So Ariel mentioned that this educational exchanges had a geopolitical motivation, at least at one point in the history. So I want to turn to China, and maybe this was going to be directed at you, Caroline,
okay.
but anybody can jump in. So, I mean, how should the U.S. Adjust its educational exchange strategy to remain competitive with China, which is also investing heavily in educational exchange for its own purposes?
So last fall, I was saying earlier, I was in Ecuador and Uruguay working with the Fulbright offices there to do some training and workshops for people from institutions there who are really interested in relationships with U.S. institutions. So that was our focus, relationships between U.S., their institutions, and our institutions. And I'd heard similar things over and over again about what the U.S. could do to make this easier for them. A lot of them had to do around the immigration and the visa policies and just clarity on that, because from an outside perspective, it can look more arbitrary than we might think that it does. And this is historical. This isn't something new. And that so there's that aspect of things. How can we make the United States more welcoming? One of NAFSA's big projects is Are You a Welcome Here campaign to make, how do international students know that we do welcome them? I think that in the same way, the more that we can get U.S. students at institutions in Latin America. When we say that a lot of students are going to Latin America, that is true, but they aren't necessarily sitting in a classroom alongside a student from, say, Argentina. Like the model of what US students tend to do is different. So how can we get them into the classroom? If the Argentine student isn't able to come to the United States, having that time together in the classroom is going to become even more important. So I do think we need to lean into that just as much as we need to lean into and make sure that the funding that historically has existed for that continues. So that funding is a big part of it. The other thing NAFSA has long time really advocated for is what is our national strategy for international education? Other countries have a plan, and we've seen periods of interest and policy points from the White House and other things, but never really, this is our strategy. States might have something like that, like Study Ohio or what have you, but unless we have a coordinated effort like China and other countries do, we're not going to be able to be all driving the bus in the same direction. And I think that's going to hurt us not just with China, but with other countries that are really emerging as they host international students.
I'll just bring in 3 other considerations because we talk about these in the policy brief, and I think across the policy brief, across the commentaries, we were seeing some similarities. One are just the historic ties. We started with that. I think Latin America and the United States have very strong historic and diplomatic ties. They have strong immigration ties with each other. And so there is a real concerted need here to focus on that, to focus on areas of similarity, to focus on historic ties that we have between the region and the United States, and how we can kind of leverage either diaspora communities or other ways to create those linkages beyond just the short-term or full degree study abroad. I think the other is the economic argument, which really is that there's a proximity, there is a physical proximity between Latin America and the United States. There are real there's real economic value to have here in terms of industry, in terms of nearshoring, in terms of areas where we can actually have an expanded, and Latin America as well can have expanded workforces. We can bridge labor gaps. So there are real kind of policy intentions here that could be also quite favorable in terms of economic value as well.
And then I think there are things that individual institutions do, like, so what would the United States do? But at an individual level, schools that tend to focus on really quality relationships with a particular school as opposed to having relationships with too many people. You always want someone that makes you feel special for the reason that you are. It helps with affordability and different models, the hybrid types of model. If we're only thinking of it, as I used to say, my mother-in-law's type of exchange where you're going and they're going for a year, that's not the model that most is going to work for this type of expansion. So individual institutions are doing some really amazing things on their own to scale up partnerships that are strong and not necessarily sign a million things. And it does help them work on these different types of models. When you have a partner that you trust and you're really working together, you're able to do so much more. So institutions, I think, are doing great things in that way. The United States as a whole has some catching up to do for sure.
Sorry, you just reminded me that I had a third factor,
Okay.
and that was actually it. It was the specific connections between higher education institutions. So to your point, Carolyn, if those institutions are working on areas of common need, on faculty exchange, not only student exchange,
right.
Let's go beyond student exchange. Let's talk about faculty. Let's talk about research. Let's talk about ways that we can actually bridge education ties in more intentional ways. We have several examples of this. We have a university in Honduras that is working with a university in North Carolina, specifically on fields of study around the textile industry, supporting the textile industry that is in Honduras, but also faculty exchange, research exchange that's specifically focused on this topic. So Caroline, to your point, that intentionality around the types of ties we are creating.
Mirka, you mentioned a few minutes ago historic ties and proximity. And I think there's no country in the region that fits that better than Mexico.
Yes.
Right? And one of the case studies in the work that CSIS and IAE have done was specifically on Mexico. So in what ways does U.S.-Mexico educational exchange reinforce like economic and workforce linkages, especially given Mexico's role in, really important role in nearshoring, even though, nearshoring persists, even though the current movement is more about reindustrialization in the United States, but still Mexico plays a really important complementary role to the U.S. economy. So how do educational exchanges make that?
Yeah,
better?
and I mean, I think this is a really clear argument around human capital. We need to build human capital, and we need to build kind of skilled labor, both in the United States and in our neighbor to the south, Mexico. There are very strong linkages we have with Mexico. International students come to the United States to study from Mexico. I will say a lot of that is in the southern part of the United States. We have a large proportion of international students who study, for example, in Texas and in other states in the southwest and southeast. I think the other area, of course, is also that Mexico, I believe, is the largest country in Latin America where U.S. students go to pursue full degrees.
That was in your report, right?
Yeah. So there is real exchange here, and to your point, I mean, we're talking about, we're talking about university exchanges, we're talking about higher education, we're talking about building skills that will be necessary for both Mexico and the United States as we move forward, and are critical, again, for that exchange that we're going to have. We know that when students, for example, pursue degrees in STEM fields, pursue degrees, and then pursue those optional practical training opportunities, they're getting experiences to work in companies that are in the United States but might have a global focus, are in the United States but might have a lot of workers from Mexico. So you're also bridging these ties in terms of these global experiences beyond the academic exchange, and you're building that connection, and particularly building that connection when we have many organizations and companies in the United States that have significant economic work with Mexico.
Yep. Ariel, I want to return to something you said earlier about these different levels of engagement. And I think there was one I'm thinking of one that you didn't mention, and I wonder the extent to which it can play a role. We talked about, obviously, national involvement. You mentioned using the State Department, and we talked about institutional cooperation. But what about like subnational governments? What about states, provinces? What is their role in all of this?
Huge. Seen from the U.S., it's quite obvious that the states can and have been playing a very important role in these exchanges. And certainly when you think about Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, you cannot, you lose a lot if you think, you take just a national approach and you don't recognize the huge diversity, heterogeneity within the countries. Again, thinking in terms of sort of a market-driven approach to education exchanges. The productive structure, the economic competitiveness approach varies across states, provinces, etc. And so the matching of demands is better done often at that level. Whether it's the wine industry in Chile and California, and the linkages with some universities that played a very important role back in the day in getting the Chilean industry, wine industry developed, or whether it's around the technology applications in health, were more concentrated in some states than in others. The opportunities are there. Now, some states in the U.S. have developed, and I think California is a good example, sort of a capacity to engage in that kind of bilateral development. But I suspect that there's plenty of more opportunities to be exploited in that direction.
And I imagine that in certain U.S. states that have greater Hispanic American populations that have stronger ties, say with Mexico, I'm thinking about the southern U.S. border, or Florida, which is kind of like a gateway to Latin America, makes sense for those kinds of states also to have dedicated programs or some sort of exchange policy on their own. Wouldn't that make sense?
Absolutely, but again, I mean, certainly, the historical linkages play a role, but trying to be forward-looking, there may be opportunities that they are not related to where, there has been a historical
more
relationship.
economic complementarity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Economic complementarity. So it's, I think, bottom line is the connections already developing at the commercial level. This can be and ought to be translated into the education level.
Can I just say, along that lines, one of the things that NAFSA is most known for is our annual conference. And one of the things I think you would agree, it's beautiful, in our very large expo hall, you see different states with a very large presence for how do they want to talk about attracting international students to their states. You see like study in Chile or study Costa Rica. I was talking with Uruguay, because when you see the presence of these organizations, along with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the State Department and other things like that, you see who really wants to be active and notice in this space. And so I can say to a country like, this is why you're losing students to another, because they've invested in this. So it's individual states from, say, Germany, like states within Germany that have developed really aggressive strategies to attract students because of business ties to different places in the U.S. that don't have a traditional German population in this case. But doing things like that and investing in it, at our conference, 40% are coming from outside the United States. So it's a huge international presence as well. But what I see the business of international educational exchange happening there, they're talking with partners, they're developing new things. And it's interesting to me, the U.S. states who show up in that way as well. So, from other countries, from other states, it's kind of, that old ride in Disney World, it's a small world after all. It feels a little bit like that, because you see who's really interested in contributing to this conversation by being at the conference, by providing that space to continue the conversations we've had over Zoom, but in person. And yeah, the states that are there, it's really interesting for me to see year over year which states are really they're having this statewide effort to attract international students.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to this idea of kind of the United States sometimes being looked at as kind of this big one monolith, but actually how decentralized the education system is, and how each of the states really work on their own. So to your point, Caroline, how many have kind of their own study in X state consortia and campaigns. They work with state chambers of commerce. So I think it's important. That's another, I think, for me, messaging that needs to be stronger, which is that you can actually bridge these very strong ties, and I think many embassies are working on that as well. The Education USA program is working on that, on kind of ensuring that there's more knowledge out there around the different ways that you can bridge those connections, and that institutions in Latin America can bridge those connections to the United States.
Everything we've talked about so far is also dependent on students being able to communicate, i.e. language proficiency, right? So, students from Latin America having a sufficient level of English to come study in the United States, and vice versa. American students wishing to go to Costa Rica or Mexico or Argentina, they need to be able not just to communicate basic things, but they're there to study. And so the proficiency has to be pretty high, and this can be a barrier in many cases. So what can be done to, what policy interventions can be done to reduce that problem with language proficiency? Yeah.
Who wants to take it? I'll say that I think the language proficiency goes in both directions, right? We really have an expectation that when international students come to the United States, they are going to be able to succeed in the classroom. That's what we all want, for them to succeed in the classroom. I think it's great over the years that there's now more options for what schools are accepting for the English proficiency, either something at the institutional level or different types of assessment mechanisms. In the same way, when U.S. students go abroad, though, they're not necessarily expecting to speak another language when they go there because of these shorter term opportunities, but quite frankly, because of the cuts that there's been to area and language studies at U.S. institutions. And as we encourage students to go to, let's call them less traditional destinations, if I go to Kenya and I developed a real interest in that area, I can't continue my study on that back in the United States. So all of this kind of goes in a big circle. If we can't sit in the classrooms students can't practice before they come to the United States. I think, so I'm delighted to see that there are now more options for gaining that English ability, and that institutions are recognizing that as well and making adaptations and maybe how they're bringing students to the United States, maybe in cohort models and other things where they're able to say, okay, in this cohort model, we will have a different level of assessment than we might in this. Even at my former institution, the English proficiency requirements varied by the type of graduate program you were going into. And that was one way they tried to say, recognizing that we're going to have more students in this type of program, we actually will accept these different English assessments, and our minimum score, what have you, is going to be different than in this other program. So that's what I've seen some institutions do, but I would love to see the U.S. continue that investment that we had during the Cold War and other things in language and area studies, because that is really, if Korea is becoming a more popular destination, as Japanese is, I know I could take Japanese in high school. Did your high school have it? And we had
Just Spanish,
Japanese
Spanish
and
and French.
Russian. We had all of these languages, even in my high school in upstate New York, and I know that they don't anymore because that interest has changed.
It's interesting, the contrast between the U.S. policy and the policies in Latin America on language. Over the last 10 or 20 years, most countries in Latin America have developed strategies for second languages, with an emphasis on English. Some have been more successful than others, but in country after country you go and you see that there is an explicit strategy. There are funds that are allocated. There is means of, in most cases, measuring learning outcomes, and as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have that in the U.S. as an explicit goal of having students be fluent in second languages.
I think we were at a apex of that, and it's definitely, I've seen the requirements for majors change. Yes.
Now it is a long-term investment. It's not easy, and it requires, that was involved in a number of evaluations of national English language learning programs in Latin America, and it's complicated. Okay, so if you don't start and you don't sustain it, it's not going to happen.
But I've seen in some countries sort of a renewed push for this. I'm thinking specifically about Guatemala, where they're trying to ramp up the level of English proficiency in schools because Guatemala is becoming a hub of business process outsourcing, so like call centers and things like that, where people who have a modicum of fluency in English, as well as obviously speaking Spanish, can get jobs that pay significantly more than others. So, I mean, language is becoming even more important as...
Absolutely. And I mean, in Latin America, I think the pioneer was Chile with the program, I think it was called Chile Abre Puertas. And it started 20 years ago, and it has gone through various administrations, and they changed a little bit what the emphasis has been, but it's been there. And since then, you see it in country after country. It's more on the U.S. side that we don't see that recognition and that investment.
I think the one other thing I'll add are just intensive English programs. Those continue to be a big priority in the United States. I know English USA works on it and just did a tour in Latin America last fall around really kind of increasing English proficiency among students who have an interest in coming to study in the United States by participating in intensive English programs. Again, this is where we start to get into some of the structural barriers around cost, ensuring that even those types of English programs are affordable. But I do think that we continue to work on mechanisms. There are mechanisms for kind of increasing proficiency. I agree, Caroline, that I think study abroad programming can do more around ensuring and embedding language study into study abroad programs. I think what we've seen more recently is that there has been, as you mentioned, kind of a prevalence of shorter term programs, of cohort-based programs, where a cohort will go to another country, but really other than the cultural means, there isn't as much going on in terms of kind of language
They're
study.
still speaking English.
They're still speaking English with each other, with the faculty that's traveling with them. There isn't as much actual language exchange. So I think it would be better to kind of continue to support and to continue to encourage that these types of programs have some element of language
When you have
study.
to start that ramp earlier as
have
well,
to.
because I was telling you on the phone, my daughter's in Eastern Europe right now. Certainly there was no option to study any of those language ahead of time, but now she is more curious, again, when she goes back. But if you're not starting that language learning early, which I've seen more and more high schools and colleges drop a language requirement, how are you ramping up the students to be comfortable to do that? And because there's less investment and interest, I don't know about interest, less investment in area studies and taking away of those majors, you are having people travel for subject-specific studies, water sanitation, security in the Middle East, those types of things, and they are multidisciplinary oftentimes. So you're bringing together students from, that's what I think attracts a lot of U.S. students to something like that. And so how can you pique their interest in starting that, preparing for it, and then continuing it when they get back? Like offering something for when they come home to continue that interest that they developed. Because if you don't, they're going to see it as something that they've done and move on.
I want to address another subject that's often mentioned, sometimes in a negative context, this question of brain drain. And one of the case studies that we did together, CSIS and IE, was looking at the Dominican Republic. And so, to what extent does increasing exchanges between Dominican Republic and the United States, how does it lead to a drain brain problem in the sense that students that come to the U.S. learn here, get a very high quality education, and sometimes would want to go back, but they don't. The country doesn't have the absorptive capacity sometimes to deal with these returnees. So, how do we address this brain drain problem?
Yeah, I think it's an important consideration. I mean, I certainly think we looked at it in the policy brief. I think there are a couple of ways to look at it. One is to consider, again, kind of what are the pathways to study and then post-study work opportunities. And are there further areas that we can look at in terms of regional mobility and regional absorption? I also think, again, if we're looking at specific industries that are growing, that have a growth factor, I think that we can see kind of that there is a better fit there and an absorption there. So I do think it's a real consideration. I do think that there are many students who are interested, for example, from the Dominican Republic to come to the United States. And it is true that, students who cross borders, particularly for graduate study, are looking for a longer term workforce or job pathway. And of course, the United States does not currently have that. It has optional practical training where if you study towards a STEM field, you can stay for up to 3 years to have a work experience. But that is very much part of your international student visa, and then you are expected to return home. And I do think that is one of the considerations that the United States continues to have, which is, yes, we want to have that exchange. Yes, we want to have those educational exchange opportunities. And we also know that these international students should be returning home.
Ariel, I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we're going to see if we get some questions from the public. I have my phone here, not because I'm checking the weather. It's because that's how the messages from the public will arrive. But we've talked a lot about university education, but in Latin America there's a great need also for technical and vocational education. And how can they increase those programs and better integrate them with institutions here in the United States and have that create a workforce that is better able to integrate with U.S. companies and value chains?
Yeah. So look, the technical vocational education sector in most countries in Latin America is one of the most old-fashioned ones and very hard to reform. They tend to be not very open to private sector participation and connections with firms, etc. So, what I see as one of the most interesting innovations that create opportunities for connections with the U.S. is around short competency-based programs, which is something that also the U.S. has been experimenting with. These programs tend to be more responsive to labor market demands. They survive only if they have and establish strong partnerships with employers. And those employers can be both national, multinational. It seems to me that it's that connection between institutions in Latin America that are innovating in terms of shorter competency-based programs. There are U.S. partners and companies that often are operating in more than one market. That's where I think the potential around the technical vocational education field resides these days.
All right, I'm going to turn to a question from the audience. And as I said earlier, as befits CSIS, it's clearly a geopolitical question. Back to China. As the U.S. tightens rules for international students, while China expands scholarships and outreach to attract more students from Latin America and the Caribbean, what long-term impacts could a growing number of Latin American students studying in China have for the region's future? Maybe I'll direct that to you.
Well, I mean, the answer is already in the question, no? And I would say it's not just China. We're seeing it in terms of both Canada and Europe.
But I think the question here is more like in terms of the cultural and sort of values-based education, I think, is different in China than, say, in a Western democracy, where it might be more oriented around listening and obeying to the authority of the state, maybe less questioning. I'm not sure, maybe that's incorrect, but I think the question is maybe around those rather than maybe, I think an education from a Latin American student going to Canada or to the United States benefits the region probably in equal measure.
Well, if you're going to go and study engineering or computer sciences or medicine, and what you care about is
the science.
The science and the affordability and of how affordable it is. In that sense, if indeed the U.S. becomes a lot more restrictive and China more open, it's going to be
It will
hard
create
to
more
compete.
linkages between Latin America and China.
You're unlikely to go and study philosophy or human rights in China. But if you ask me, where is the demand for foreign studies or studying abroad going to go in the long run, it's not going to be linked to philosophy or human rights. It's going to be more linked to STEM fields.
Right.
But I think I I think that there is a lot that stands to lose here. And one of the things I focus on a lot are our U.S. colleges and universities. What will they lose if they don't have international students from Latin America, but also from elsewhere in the world? Again, I think that there is a lot to be lost here in terms of our U.S. colleges and universities losing a global focus. Losing that global focus to places like China. I think the United States higher education system, the reason it is so popular, the reason why we are the #1 host of international students is because of the campus experience, the higher education experience. U.S. colleges and universities not only deliver quality education, but they deliver an experience, a global immersive experience for their international students, which is really unlike many places in the world, and particularly some places like China. So I think that, there is the experience that international students will get, but it's also what we stand to lose if our colleges and universities do not attract those international students, and the U.S. students that are here in the U.S. actually don't have that kind of global exchange and that global perspective from students from around the world on their campuses.
I have another question here from the public, which in fact was one of the questions I was going to ask. I think this is very relevant, and I think we'll end with this one. But how can education policy, both in Latin America and in the U.S., improve in order to give more study abroad opportunities to lower income students or rural students or other marginalized groups? I would imagine, indigenous groups.
Yeah, so I was thinking through all the topics we covered today, and we touched on the topic of cost a few times, but perhaps not enough, which really is one of the largest structural barriers. When we look at the data, we see that the largest peaks of Latin American student migration to the United States was during times of those large scholarship programs. If you remember, the Brazil Scientific Mobility Program, the 100,000 Strong initiatives. These were incentives by the Latin American governments, by the U.S. governments, to really support students because of some of the structural barriers around cost. And this absolutely goes to also students from disadvantaged populations or who would not otherwise have an opportunity for a education abroad experience. I think this is critical. This is critical for us to consider, at the national level, but also all the way down to state levels and also to institutional levels. One of the most innovative things I have heard about are different models where institutions are offsetting costs for students through either partnership models or models with different institutions. So hybrid models are another opportunity. 2+2 models with community colleges in the United States. For study abroad, certainly looking at scholarship programs like the Gilman program is another way to think about how we can further support these students and ensure that, yes, that education abroad is not an elitist activity. It's not only reserved for those who can afford and have the means, but it can actually be something that's afforded and provides access to full populations.
Terrific. I think we'll have to leave it there. I'd like to thank the three of you for not only your time, but your insights into this really critical issue. Thank you, Mirka, Ariel, Caroline.
Thank you, Chris.
And for the online audience, please remember to check out the CSIS America's webpage for the policy brief and area studies commentaries related to this topic, as well as other issues on Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much.